for people that really would like to know about how archaeology supports the Bible, and that's not to say that archaeology is 100%, that we are just finding things left and right and it's proving the Bible all over the place and there's no problems. There are, of course, challenges and people dispute interpretations of some artifacts. But one of the best books that's come out in recent years, and I still think is probably one of the best, is written by, and I don't know, on my screen, this is backwards. Maybe, are you reading this in the front way? Okay. It's entitled,
Yes, it's right.
yeah, you can see it okay?
Yes.
Yeah, it's on the reliability of the Old Testament by a British Egyptologist who's also an evangelical Christian. He's well up in his upper 80s by now, if not more. I think he's still alive. I've met him on a couple of occasions, Kenneth A. Kitchen. And he put this book together from articles he'd written over a number of years. And he has, in this book, compiled all the archaeological evidence that seems to show that the Old Testament narrative, or whoever wrote, of course, we would say it was Moses for the Pentateuch, of course, and then the various prophets, but whoever wrote the Old Testament knew what they were talking about. They were describing real people, real events, and real places. And consistently, archaeological discoveries are showing this to be the case. So a little bit of my presentation today, and I don't think it's too long. You said about, 20 minutes or something like that, is based on this particular book. I have a PowerPoint that's actually, and I'll do the screen share right now, go to maximum. It's based on this actual book on the reliability of the Old Testament. I have over 200 slides here, so there's no way we can go through all the pictures, but I wanted to hit some of the high points. I remember a few years ago, a U.S. News and World Report magazine came out after a PBS show about archaeology in the Bible was broadcast. This is an old thing. It's an artifact now. This is hard copy. Most of these magazines don't exist anymore. They're only digital form online. But after the PBS show, they asked the question, is the Bible true? Which is sort of a modernist, not a postmodern question, but people still in the back of their minds, they want to know whether this book that's so central to Western civilization, at least, doesn't know what it's talking about. Are the facts, the people, the events, and so forth, are they really true? Did they really happen? And this makes a big difference to people, how they view God and how they view their own existence. There was a famous archaeologist, more active in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. He actually gave the prayer at John F. Kennedy's inauguration. He was a rabbi, Nelson Glick, and he wrote a book, Rivers in the Desert, and he writes, it may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. That was a pretty bold statement. And while some may question it, I think we can say, thanks to the work of Kenneth Kitchen, that still holds today. So this guy right here, you can see the arrow going around. This is Max Miller. I worked with him on various projects, including an issue of biblical archaeology several years ago. So we're friends, but his view of the Bible is a bit different than mine. There's a younger picture of him. He became quite skeptical. He started off as a person of faith, but the more he studied archaeology, he felt there just wasn't enough written epigraphical sources to confirm biblical people and biblical events. He had high hopes at first, but then he became rather a pessimist. And he gave a bunch of examples. Some things that have been discovered, like the name of Israel appears in a inscription by the Egyptian Pharaoh Merneptah. And so we know that Israel existed. We have the Tel Dan inscription, which makes reference to the house of David. That's actually King David. This was quite controversial when it was found, but most people acknowledge that this is indeed talking about the David of the Bible. But Max, after looking at all the evidence that's come to light, says, yet when all is taken into account, the epigraphical evidence pertaining to ancient Israel is meager and disappointing. And I kind of call Max's view the glass half empty approach. A lot of people sort of have an attitude. They look at things and they either have a positive attitude or a negative attitude. I think Max has been a little more optimistic in recent times. I've had a chat or two with him, and I'm not sure he's as pessimistic as he was a few years ago. But the other person is Kenneth Kitchen, the Egyptologist I mentioned, who wrote this book that I showed you. He was living in Liverpool. He has the glasses half full kind of approach, and he has compiled in this book all the evidence that seems to suggest that whoever wrote the Bible was talking about real people and real events, and that the Bible basically is a reliable account of what happened in biblical history. I want to pause here and make reference to another Bible scholar. I don't have his picture on this particular group of slides, but he's a very famous biblical archaeologist, if you will. His name is William F. Albright. He died back in the early 70s, as I recall. He's called a 20th century genius. He mastered all the ancient Near Eastern languages and really was sort of the founding father of what we call biblical archaeology. He had a student named G. Ernest Wright, and G. Ernest Wright taught at Harvard University, and G. Ernest Wright wrote a very important book called The God Who Acts. And his basic premise in this book was that the ancient Hebrews were convinced that the God of their Bible was only really God and only important as compared to all the other deities of the ancient Near East that were talked about by the other peoples, because the Hebrew God actually acted in our time-space continuum. It wasn't those words, but that's what G. Ernest Wright was talking about, that the God of the Bible was thought by the Israelites to actually have acted in history by making the Red Sea open, by doing miracles before the people of Israel, by raising dead people back to life again. That this was not just something that was metaphorical or symbolic or something, but that the ancient Hebrews really thought these things happened, and they really thought their God was the God of history, and that the accounts in the Bible of historical events by all the different prophets and the different famous people, Noah, Abraham, Moses, these were real people whom God really worked through to make these events come into place. So having that understanding of the ancient understanding of the Bible compared with the archaeological evidence that has come to light gives a lot of credibility to the ancient Hebrew belief that God really existed and worked through these people, and that these events are reflections of God's supernatural activity in our time and space continuum. So Kitchen, and I'll just mention a few of these things, and you'll have to let me know when I have to close down here, but he notes that in the book of Kings, for example, these are a couple of historical books in the Old Testament, virtually all of the Israelite, Judahite, and Assyrian and Egyptian kings that are mentioned in the Bible have been attested, have been proven, if you will, by extra biblical archaeological finds. Their names, pictures of them, have been found in archaeological sites, so that we know that these people were not just, mythical people that somebody made up, like maybe King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, although now scholars are saying King Arthur was a real person, so we have to be careful who we see as mythological. But we have plenty of evidence for these Israelite, Judahite, Assyrian, Egyptian, Babylonian kings as well, really were people, and they were tied to the actual events that are mentioned in the Bible. Another scholar who I know, Baruch Halpern, a Jewish scholar, biblical historian at the University of Georgia, makes the same point. And he's coming from a more skeptical perspective. He's a classical defender of historical criticism, but he notes that the biblical list of rulers that we find in the Bible comports very well with extra biblical sources. The kings and the leaders that we read about in the Bible live at the same time, has extra biblical sources say they lived, and in the same sequence. So whoever was writing the biblical story was following actual history that can be verified by extra biblical sources, particularly Egyptian, Assyrian, and Babylonian sources. So it's rather remarkable how tight the biblical history actually is, particularly after the time of King David. For a few examples, Kenneth Kitchen notes that the foreign rulers, those who are not Hebrew, who are mentioned in the Bible record, there's at least 20 names that are mentioned of different kings and a general. Of those who are mentioned in the Bible, all but three have turned up in external records, 17 out of 20. And they're usually found living in Assyria or Babylon or Egypt or maybe the Hittite lands or wherever. just as the Bible describes them. The three rulers that aren't mentioned came from periods where the local records, the archaeological record, is still missing. So as archaeologists continue to excavate, it's very likely they'll be able to find those local records, and we'll find those three missing rulers as well. Conversely, when you look at the Hebrew kings that are mentioned in the Bible and see if they exist in foreign records, for example, the Egyptian, Assyrian, or Babylonian records, we find that 9 out of 14 Hebrew kings are actually named extra biblically in archaeological inscriptions from these foreign countries. The 5 missing men, 3 of them were kings, very, very short periods of time, or rulers, and 2 reigned when Assyria was not active in the region, so they weren't mentioned by the Assyrians. So there's a good explanation for the 5 missing people, but the others are well attested. For example, Omri and Ahab are known outside of the Bible. They were real people. They really existed. A big inscription found just south of where I work in Jordan, the Mesha inscription, mentions Omri and Ahab as being very important and active kings, for example. Then these Hebrew kings, they not only appear in extra biblical records in Egypt or Assyria or Babylon, but we find their actual names in Palestine itself, in their home turf, so to speak, in local records. We have the names of Joram 1 and 2, Ahaziah 2, Uzziah, Jeroboam 2, Hoshea, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah. These latter ones you probably know better. These are all known to have been real people based on the discovery of seals and bulla, like pieces of clay with stamps on them, that have their names and their icons actually stamped on these seals. And they date to the very time period when the Bible says these people actually lived. So when you look at the names, you look at where they're living. You also look at the sequence of the rulers and the chronology of the Bible, particularly of the divided monarchy. It fits almost perfectly with the extra biblical sources. The chronology of the Bible lines up very nicely with the Assyrian, Babylonian, and the Egyptian records, and later too in the Persian period when you get down to the time of Queen Esther. So all of these things together give a lot of confidence. I know of very few archaeologists, even those that don't believe in the Holy Spirit being the source of inspiration for the writing of the text. They don't believe that the prophets were inspired people. They will acknowledge that whoever wrote these stories down actually were talking about real people and real events and dated them to the right time period. At least 10 different historical events or episodes exist in both Hebrew and external sources so far. For example, King Mesha talks about his fights with Omri and Ahab. We have his side of the story, and we have the Bible side of the story. We have Shishak fighting against Judah. He was a king. Shashank was his Egyptian name. We have his records in Egypt, and we can compare some of his writings fighting against the area of Judah with what the Bible says in terms of Shashank's attacks against Judah. The story of Lachish is mentioned in the Bible in 2 Kings and in Chronicles and in the book of Isaiah, where an Assyrian king Sennacherib comes down and attacks this Hebrew city during the time of King Hezekiah. We actually have found records of this same battle in Sennacherib's annals that have been found in Assyria. Pictures of the battle have been found on the walls of his palace, and the excavations conducted at Lachish actually show archaeological evidence of the very battle mentioned in both the Bible and the Assyrian records. And we could go on with Ahab and Karkar, King Jehu, and the Assyrian king Shalmaneser. So the story goes kind of on and on. Now, I've been talking for a few minutes, and I don't know, this kind of is about a 15, 20-minute thing. It gives a little bit of an overview, particularly in later Old Testament history, of how reliable the Old Testament's proven to be. So now there's a lot of other questions. What about the earlier parts of the Bible? What about Moses? What about the Exodus? And even earlier, the patriarchal period, going all the way back to the story of the flood. I just came back literally from Mount Ararat. I climbed it last week for the second time, and we have discovered some wooden structures on the top of the mountain. We're in the process of exploring those right now. But of course, the instinct of many people is, hey, have you found Noah's Ark? We're not quite ready to say that, but there's no doubt that a lot of people thought the Ark was up there, and they climbed up there and worshiped. They built wooden structures up there, it appears, and they brought a lot of artifacts up there, including holy books, and they left them on top of Mount Ararat. So we're trying to sort that all out right now. But the more we get into the history via archaeology, we seem to find that whoever was writing these Bible stories knew what they were talking about. Then that raises the philosophical, theological question of, was God involved in preserving and conveying this knowledge to the prophets that could be shared with us even today? So maybe I'll pause with that. And I don't know how much more time you have, but we can see if anyone has questions or reactions to that. Well, then maybe I'll jump over here. I'm going to do another PowerPoint. They kind of overlap, and I'll just kind of go through rapid fire some of the archaeological discoveries that have been made so that you can get an idea of the things we see. Now, trying to get this to work. Let's see. I need to go back to share screen, I guess. We'll do this one. Are you seeing pictures again?
Yes, I see the picture.
Okay.
Coming through.
So I'm just going to go through kind of rapid fire with a number of very interesting and important archaeological discoveries. Some are older ones from the 19th century, and some are actually quite recent. Every year, more archaeological discoveries are coming to light, and some of them are rather remarkable. There's so many, it's hard to even know where to begin. But one of the most famous archaeological discoveries happened in the 1870s when a young man, his name was George Smith, he was hired to sweep the British Museum floor. And while he was there, he's watching all these guys looking at new tablet fragments that were coming from Mesopotamia in the 1870s, 1860s, and 70s. And he talked to them, and he eventually learned how to read the cuneiform writing, the script, actually, or the language is Akkadian. And he started helping them glue pieces of the tablets back together. They were broken tablets, and so he was putting them together. And he came across a version of the flood story from the Mesopotamian perspective. It's very famous now. It's called the Gilgamesh Epic. And of that epic, which is in a dozen tablets, tablet 11 records a story of the flood. Part of this was taken from an earlier flood story known as the Atrahasis epic. And what's fascinating about that is when you read the Atrahasis creation flood story, particularly the flood story, it seems evident that the Bible story, Genesis chapters 6, 7, and 8, thereabouts, whoever wrote that, we believe it was Moses, seemed to have been very aware of the Mesopotamian flood story, because the sequence of topics that are discussed and even little details like birds being released out of the ark and sacrifice being offered to God or the gods in the Mesopotamian version are almost identical, so much so that to put it in a believer's terms, it seems like Moses had a copy of the Atrahasis epic from which Gilgamesh would be drawn later on. And he was maybe under inspiration writing the true story of the flood as opposed to what the Mesopotamian people were teaching. There's a lot of similarities, but there were some very strident differences too. So the discovery of this flood story at the time was extremely exciting to people. In the 1870s, this young man, George Smith, was asked to give a paper at the Society for Biblical Archaeology, and it was like a standing room only. Today's equivalent would be CNN and Fox News and MSNBC would all be there. And it made the newspapers around the world at the time. Some tablets were missing, and they asked George Smith to go back and find the rest of the tablets. He actually did that. People raised money. He went all the way back to Mesopotamia from London, which is kind of like going to the moon nowadays, very remote area, like me going to maybe to Mount Ararat. And he actually found some of the missing tablets, but he died of dysentery on the trip. He was only in his 30s, a very bright prospect for scholarship, but he did get the tablets back, and they were able to put together more of this, some of these ancient primordial stories of the Earth's origins, the flood, and so forth. So this was a very important discovery. Another very important discovery that helped break open the context of the biblical story was the Rosetta Stone, which was initially found by French military engineers as they were preparing to fight against both local people in Egypt and the British. The British eventually conquered the French and were able to take the Rosetta Stone as war booty, and it's now in the British Museum. But what was interesting about this stone is that it was written in 3 languages. 2 of the languages were Egyptian and 2 different scripts, hieroglyphics, which nobody could understand at the time, and then a kind of a cursive demotic form, and then they had the Greek form. Now, people at this time could read Greek, and so by using the Greek part of the text, they were able to finally break the code of the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and that opened up the whole story of Egyptian history, which provides so much background to the biblical story. Many biblical writers, of course, Abraham goes to Egypt. The Israelites are enslaved in Egypt. Moses delivers the Israelites from Egypt. And so the discovery of Egyptian language provided us with an opportunity to look at the background of many biblical stories. So this was an incredibly important story, and you sometimes wonder whether it was providentially designed that some soldiers digging a trench would find this very important linguistic tool that is so important today. I mentioned a little while ago a very important discovery found by Sir Flinders Petrie, a British scholar. It's a very tall monument. It's about twice as tall as a human being standing there. It's called the Merneptah Stela. It was written about the year 1207 BC. You have to understand that there are a number of scholars that doubt that Israel ever really existed as a people, certainly not in earlier times. And yet here we have a mention of Israel as early as 1207, which would be about the time of the Judges, after the time of Moses, in most people's thinking, at least in the biblical chronology's thinking. But you have on the bottom line where the yellow arrow is the actual name of Israel. And while a few scholars have tried to dispute that name, almost everybody agrees this is indeed the first extra biblical appearance of the name Israel in archaeological evidence. Recently, a couple of German scholars found another stone in the Berlin Museum. They say it actually pushes the name of Israel back 200 more years to the 1400s, which is about the time of the biblical chronology's date for the Exodus. So a number of discoveries have actually proven the ancient existence of a people called Israel, which is, of course, important. This is the Mesha inscription. This was found in 1867 in the Moabite city known as Dibon, which is just a few miles of where I've been working for the last almost 30 years now at Tel Jalul near Madaba in Jordan. This particular stela, it was found intact. Bedouin, when they realized they had this in their possession in the town of Dibon, they realized that this might be of interest to Westerners, and so they decided to heat it up and throw the thing into a fire, and then they threw cold water on it, cracking the stela. Some say they did this because they didn't want the Westerners to get it. Others say they thought there was a genie trapped inside and wanted the spirit to be released. And yet others say that the Bedouin did this so they could sell the parts piecemeal to the Westerners, knowing they'd get a lot more money. I'm not sure which of those stories is true. The stone was broken, but before it was broken, the missionary was able to take some paper towels, he got them wet, and made an impression, a reversed impression of it, a squeeze we call it today. And the original squeeze from 1867 is still in the Louvre Museum in France, in Paris. So archaeologists, epigraphers were able to reconstruct the entire inscription, even though it was broken, and they were able to glue the pieces back together. You can still see it in the Louvre today. But this particular inscription talks about Mesha, the king of the Moabites, in the 9th century, fighting against Ahab and Omri. Omri is specifically mentioned in this stela, and so we have the battle that's discussed in 2 Kings 3. We have an extra biblical version of that from Mesha's inscription. So very important in correlating with biblical history. Of course, Mesha gives a different outcome for the battle than the Israelites do. The Israelites say they won. Mesha says he won. And so you can see a little bit of tension. And of course, which God was stronger, the Mesha God or the Yahweh, the God of the Israelites? So then we have examples of seals. This is a seal here. This would be a small seal about the size of maybe a nickel in our currency today. And these would be made out of a soft clay and maybe put on a parchment letter that would be rolled up a scroll. tied with string, and then they put a seal on it to show this came from the king. The symbol of a flying scarab, the winged beetle that you see in the middle of this on the right. Then it has an inscription up at the top. It'll say Yehuda, Judah, and then the bottom line basically talks about belonging to Hezekiah, the king, belonging to Hezekiah, and then it actually mentions his son Ahaz, king of Judah, as well. So you have this ancient inscription talking about two biblical kings, Hezekiah and Ahaz. Here's a photograph of it taken from a magazine. I've done some research on it. It seems like the beetle with the wings out was the equivalent of the eagle that we use today in the United States for our national symbol, so to speak. Another very famous discovery that was done in the 19th century, that was found in the 19th century, is the Siloam Tunnel inscription found in Jerusalem in the south end of what's called the City of David, south of the Temple Mount with the famous golden dome of the rock that you often see and hear about in the news. There's a passage in Kings chapter 20, verses 20 to 21. It says, "Now the rest of the acts of Hezekiah, all his might, and how he made a pool and a tunnel and brought water into the city." This was a big accomplishment, apparently, by King Hezekiah. And the writer says, "Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah?" And then Hezekiah rested with his fathers. Well, this water tunnel and the pool have actually been found along with an inscription that was found. The tunnel was built by King Hezekiah just before the Assyrian king Sennacherib attacked Jerusalem. Hezekiah wanted to make sure there's plenty of water inside the city, so he disguised the water spring from the outside, diverted the water to the inside of the city, made a big reservoir so plenty of water would be available to the people. And then when they completed the tunnel, his engineers bragged about it by writing in Paleo Hebrew, reading from right to left. And it tells the story of how two teams of workers working for the king started digging through solid rock towards each other, one from the spring source and the other from where the pool would be. And eventually they met in the middle, and the water started flowing from the spring into the pool inside the city. The spring was disguised from the Assyrians on the outside, and so the Jews on the inside, or the Hebrews, had plenty of water. So we have this discovery of an inscription that verifies 2 Kings 20 and 2 Chronicles 32, a rather dramatic find. The inscription was chiseled off the wall and taken to Istanbul because in the 19th century, Palestine was under the control of the Ottomans. And so today, I was just there not too long ago, you can see this inscription inside the Istanbul Museum, their archaeological museum. Then we have other little examples. Sometimes the discoveries are big, sometimes they're little. This is the seal of Manasseh, son of the king, belonged to a son of King Hezekiah. And then one of the most famous discoveries made a few years ago was at Tel Dan on the northern border of Israel today with Lebanon. In this photograph, you can see the hills in the distance. Those are in the modern country of Lebanon, which Syria kind of thinks belongs to them. And where the trees are at the bottom, that's the ancient archaeological site of Dan. Goes all the way back to Abraham's time. They even found a mud brick gate on the right-hand side of the site where there's kind of a little bit of a whitish area. I don't know if I can circle it right there. That's where the Abraham gate is. But over on the south side of the site right here, they found an Iron Age gate. And in that gate, they found a reused stone, and it turned out to have writing on it. Here's the gate area at the top. And in one of the walls here, they found actually 3 pieces of stone. And it turned out this was a victory stela by a Syrian king bragging how he had captured the Israelite city of Dan. And he talks right here where it's kind of white. This is Abraham Bayron, the director of the dig. He died just a few years ago. I think you see him up here chomping on his cigar. He was an Israeli scholar. Here he's proudly smiling at his discovery here. And in these letters right here, it talks about this is the BT, and then this is the DVD. The house beat or bait stands for the Aramaic, or that would be the Syrian version of the word. The Hebrew word is identical, Beit David, the house of David. So this was a dynastic conquest according to the Syrian king. And he's bragging about defeating the house or the dynasty of David. This would be a few years after David, of course, was gone during the time of the divided monarchy. So this was a very big discovery, and it was very controversial at the time. People didn't want to believe that David really existed. In fact, I remember just before this discovery was announced, I was in Chicago and they were having a big meeting there, a whole session, a scholarly session of archaeologists were talking about whether King David was a real person or not. And some scholar concluded he was no more historical than King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, that David is more mythological than real. It was shortly after that they actually found the stone with David's name on it, and that sent shock waves around the scholarly world. A lot of people tried to deny David's name was actually there. You can see in this picture, if you can read the Paleo-Hebrew, this is a D, this is a V or a Va, and this is another D, David, right there. But they tried to change it to mean or sound like the word dude or some other word that would mean uncle, the house of the uncle, the house of a pot or a kettle or something like that. But that seemed rather desperate, and most scholars said, get over it. We found David. And I think that's the general consensus now. So this is one of 3 inscriptions that archaeologists have found over the last 15, 20 years that mention King David as being a real historical person. And of course, once you accept that, then it's easier for the other parts of the David story to fall in place, and you start taking those seriously as well. So this was a very important discovery. Maybe one more, and then we'll take some time for some questions. Ahab, of course, was one of the famous Israelite kings. He's mentioned extra biblically in the famous Kar Stela, which describes a battle against the Assyrians, particularly Shalmaneser III, against a coalition of Western kings from Syria and Israel and so forth. Ahab was one of the key kings. He contributed an awful lot of chariots to this battle, but he ultimately lost. And we have reference in this stela outside of the Bible of Ahab the Israelite being at the Battle of Karkar. And we have a precise date, 853 BC, and that we can use as an anchor date outside the Bible for the biblical chronology. And we can work that date all the way back to the earlier kings of Israel to the time of Solomon. We know exactly when he reigned now, and we know exactly when King David reigned, and of course his predecessor Saul. And we can go the other direction, date since 853. So this was an anchor point, and it was an Adventist scholar named Edwin Thiele. I had the privilege of hearing him lecture on this a couple times before he passed away several years ago. He wrote a book called The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings, in which he showed that the chronological evidence in both the Book of Chronicles and Kings is actually quite accurate when you know how the Hebrews calculated their reigns. They used 2 different systems, actually, in the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And when he got that all sorted out, he was able to show that the biblical chronology was extremely accurate. And I've talked to several scholars, not Adventist scholars, who today say that this work by the Adventist scholar Thiele is probably the best work on chronology for that part of ancient Near Eastern history. So Adventists have been kind of at the foundational work of a lot of these big discoveries. A couple other quick things. Here's the seal of Jezebel. That's what the actual letters say in here. It has Phoenician, Egyptian iconography. This is probably the wife of King Ahab of Israel. And her name, YZ, which Y would be like a J, BL, Jezebel, actually appears in this inscription. So here you have the black obelisk, very famous. It shows the first picture of an Israelite king, Jehu, bowing down before the Assyrian king Shalmaneser, paying tribute. We have a copy of this. It's in the British Museum, and we've got a copy in the Horn Museum here at Andrews University. And here you can see at the bottom in this little stocking cap, King Jehu of Israel bowing down before Shalmaneser the king. And we know the names and the events based on the cuneiform script above the figures. So this gives a little example. And again, I have over 200 slides. I've just shown you a dozen or so of the kinds of archaeological discoveries that show the basic Bible story, certainly from the time of David all the way down to the time of Jesus, is quite accurate and is being cross-referenced extra biblically all the time. What we can't prove, of course, are the events, the historical supernatural element when God comes in and does a miracle. We can't prove that part of it scientifically, but we can prove the basic event and the people quite accurately now. And so Kenneth Kitchen's book title on the reliability of the Old Testament seems aptly named, in my opinion, and I think many scholars would agree with that. So maybe with that, we'll stop sharing here. It gives you an idea. There's a lot more that we could share, but gives you a little hint of why I like doing archaeology.